Good morning, friends, and welcome. First off, we have a message here from our Mumbai Lodge, which is known to most of us, our Bombay Lodge. That was the old name of the city. They're saying, "Dear friends, we send you fraternal greetings and all good wishes on the forthcoming occasion of ULT Day, which is today, when we commemorate the passing away of the founder, Mr. Robert Crosby. Remembering that we are all theosophically speaking keepers and helpers of each other, let us work with zeal and energy, with unwavering devotion to the masters and the cause, so as to enrich what Mr. Judge calls the international theosophic karma for the benefit of all." And they are also having a meeting today at 6:15 p.m., which I believe is about this time, so they're getting their meeting going as well. Yes, the United Lodge of Theosophists was founded in 1909, as we all know here, by Mr. Crosby. He found the need to do this in order to regenerate the original teachings as presented to us by the founders of the Theosophical movement. Today we're going to have a total of 4 readings, 3 readings to start with. One by H.P. Blavatsky would be the first reading, William Q. Judge the second reading, Robert Crosby the third reading, and then we'll have a biographical talk, an overview of the life, work, and influence of Mr. Crosby, and our great appreciation for him bringing back to us the original teachings. Then we'll have a 4th reading by Mr. Crosby again, writings of him. We'll follow that by closing remarks and renewal of fellowship. We'll have a brief break to do that, and then we'll do our 12:30 meeting, which is a roundtable discussion on the key to theosophy. So with that, we will have reading number 1 from the writings of H.P. Blavatsky.
This is reading 1. The beacon light upon which the eyes of all real theosophists are fixed is the same towards which in all ages the imprisoned human soul has struggled. This beacon, whose light shines upon no earthly seas, but which has mirrored itself in the somber depths of the primordial waters of infinite space, is called by us, as by the earliest theosophists, divine wisdom. This name wisdom, or we say sometimes the wisdom religion or theosophy, is as old as the human mind. The title of sages, the priests of this worship of truth, was its first derivative. These names were afterwards transformed into philosophy and philosophers, the lovers of science or of wisdom. It is to Pythagoras that we owe that name, as also that of gnosis, the system of the knowledge of things as they are, or of the essence that is hidden beneath the external appearances. Under that name, so noble and so correct in its definition, all the masters of antiquity designated the aggregate of our knowledge of things, human and divine. Theosophy being the way that leads to truth in every religion, as in every science, occultism is, so to say, the touchstone and universal solvent. It is the thread of Ariadne given by the master to the disciple, who ventures into the labyrinth of the mysteries of being, the torch that lights him through the dangerous maze of life, forever the enigma of the Sphinx. But the light thrown by this torch can be discerned only by the eye of the awakened soul, by our spiritual senses. It blinds the eye of the materialist, as the sun blinds that of the owl. Belief in the masters was never made an article of faith for theosophists, but this is what one of them wrote in a letter preserved to this day. Theosophy must not represent merely a collection of moral verities, a bundle of metaphysical ethics epitomized in theoretical dissertations. Theosophy must be made practical. It has to find objective expression in an all-embracing code of life, thoroughly impregnated with its spirit, the spirit of mutual tolerance, charity, and love. It is only theosophy, well understood, that can save the world from despair by reproducing the social and religious reform, a task once before accomplished in history by Gautama the Buddha, a peaceful reform without one drop of blood spilled. For many a long year, the great orphan humanity has been crying aloud in the darkness for guidance and for light. Amid the increasing splendors of a progress purely material, of a science that nourished the intellect but left the spirit to starve, humanity, dimly feeling its origin and presaging its destiny, has stretched out towards the east, empty hands that only a spiritual philosophy can fill. Only the masters of the Eastern wisdom can satisfy at once the intellect and the spirit, can guide humanity safely through the night to the dawn of a larger day.
This is from the writings of William Q. Judge. Underlying the doctrines of theosophy is one fundamental proposition, namely the essential unity of all life and being. The manifestation of life is differentiation of this unity. The purpose of differentiation is evolution, and the destiny of evolution is the return of all manifestation into its source and original unity. Of the manifestation of life, there are two phases, poles, or aspects: the descent of spirit into matter and the ascent of matter into spirit. The infinite variety of gradation in development between these two poles marks the degree of differentiation from the unity in its downward or upward course. Theosophy is not a new invention, but the essential underlying truth of all philosophies. It is a body of doctrine in philosophy, science, and ethics, principally derived from the Eastern archaic sacred theories, which were worked out by a brotherhood of devotees and initiates who used every method of scientific investigation known to us, as well as their own highly developed practices of observation, experiment, concentration, and meditation to reach the truth. They traced all phenomena by every possible means from their significance to their source, and by comparison of their independent searches and observations, recorded their conclusions, and accepted such results only as could stand the test of applicability and verification from every point and in every conceivable direction. This slowly accumulating body of facts furnished the basis for these great universal doctrines, handed down from generation to generation since time immemorial. Portions are given out from time to time, such as may be safely trusted to an advancing age, because to penetrate into the mystery of nature requires a state of the greatest purity and perfection. And this final perfection is not a gift to be expected from without, but is to be worked for by those who desire it. It is often queried why this grand philosophy has existed for so long a time, and yet so little of it has reached our all-conquering civilization. This is due to the fact that our civilization has mainly occupied itself with material and intellectual progress, refusing to even recognize the superior faculties of intuition and man's capability of spiritual culture. It is the aim of theosophy to bring to the notice of those who are inclined to admit the spiritual nature of man and his progressive evolution, that on another plane of existence, a plane which partakes of a wider field of consciousness and which lies within the capability of development in every individual, that on that higher plane there's a spiritual unity, a universal brotherhood of mankind, and on that plane of being there is no separateness from homogeneous existence, and further that no permanent progress is possible through fostering the illusion of separateness, and that man's true duty at all times and in all circumstances is the love of his kind and the preservation of harmony around him.
This reading's from the writings of Robert Crosby. The seeker for truth and knowledge must see the one self in all things, and all things in itself, and then act for and as the self of all. All sacred writings are addressed to the individual, for it is from within the individual and the individual alone that reformation can begin and must be consummated. The study and application of the Gita tends to break down all ideas based upon separateness and impresses upon the student that the way of true knowledge of the divine perfection lies in universal service. Theosophists of every degree should realize that under karma, much is required of those to whom much has been given in opportunity and knowledge. We can only use our opportunities and knowledge to the best possible advantage and continue to do so if we will not ourselves fall short of the requirement of laws, compassion absolute. The real point of issue is the divine nature in man. We find ourselves prevented on every hand from taking the position of the true nature. It seems impossible, but this is only a delusion born from the false faith we have held. We have established ideas, likes and dislikes and feelings, which under the law of return of impressions recur again and again. The moment we attempt to take an opposite stand, we meet the result of the combined action of all those forces within ourselves. This is what we may call the war in heaven. The war in the man's own nature. But if he remains true to his own spiritual nature, he is bound to be the conqueror. If he has faith in the law of his own nature, he will go forward. And gradually the obstacles will disappear. Each man is responsible for his own external affairs, conditions, and circumstances, for his character, qualities, and tendencies, for his mental, moral, psychic, and spiritual nature upon every plane of consciousness. He is likewise responsible for the effects of his thought and action on his fellow men and on the kingdoms below man. He cannot save himself at the expense of any other being, nor can he have the happiness so long as any of his fellow men suffer. As he is a self-conscious being with the power of acquiring qualities and of manipulating the lower natures, it devolves upon him to understand the nature of all things that he may use them beneficently. Only when the feeling of responsibility, which is the beginning of selflessness, moves men to clarification of their minds and to conformity of feeling, thought, and act with the true rationale of life, can this understanding be had. When all our false beliefs, our desires, and passions, our likes and dislikes, have fallen away from us like cast-off garments, and we have resumed that nature of us which is divine, then we shall be able to build a civilization as much higher than this as we can possibly imagine.
Friends, it's difficult to really capture a person's life in a short biographical sketch, and probably more important to try to capture that person's impact. So the biographical sketch here will really take on two parts. We'll first cover some of the highlights of Mr. Crosby's life as the founder of the United Lodge of Theosophists, and then another student will endeavor to enhance that by really discussing his influence and impact. In 1907, in March, he wrote his own biographical notes. So we'll draw mostly from that. We'll simply read his words as he wrote them about his own life in 1907. Of course, he went on to live for a while after that, and we'll talk about the events of his life after that in a different format. So, Mr. Crosby says, I was born into the present physical body on January 10th, 1849, in the city of Montreal, Canada. My parents were both Scotch, and they met and married in Canada, my father having been connected to the Hudson Bay Company for many years, traveling from post to post, and my mother being companion to Lady Simpson, the wife of the governor of the Hudson Bay Company. In the early days, the family was brought up in the Presbyterian faith, and I have a distinct recollection of the gloom of the Sabbaths and the horrible incubus of the doctrines inculcated. Later, my father asserted a more rational view of religion, as also did my mother, although nominally retaining their connection with the church. My mother, being of Highland blood, had the characteristics of that people, among them known as second sight, that is, clairvoyance. She made no attempts to use this faculty, but showed instances of its possession on important occasions affecting her people. What is termed the religious instinct was strong in her, and her life was one of self-sacrifice, and she never consulted her own comfort. I realized later, and perhaps more fully now, how much I am indebted to her for much of the ease of response in certain lines, of the body she gave to me. Great karma will sometime permit me to repay that soul with whatever of knowledge I may have gained. Although my parents relaxed much in their application of the tenets of their faith, the children, of whom I was the eldest, were sent to Sabbath school. Thus it went on for some years, I endeavoring by study and instruction to, quote, reach salvation, unquote, but never at all succeeding in reaching any condition which would represent the wonderful change such realization must necessarily be. When I was 16 years of age, my dear old Sunday school teacher took me aside and seriously talked to me of joining the, quote, communion, unquote. I was amazed and startled and at once replied that I was not fit. I had no realization of salvation such as I had heard of. His reply was that a young man was safer as a communicant than otherwise. But, said I, does not the Bible say that he who eats and drinks unworthily at the table of the Lord is condemned? He admitted that it did, but that the association would be good for me, and light might come later. Still amazed, I asked him if many had joined the communion without realization. His reply was, most of them. I do not remember what further speech we had, if any, but I do remember how utterly alone I felt, and how completely the whole superstructure of the church fell to pieces. I then began to search for the truth. I pictured to myself a person with full reasoning powers, never having heard of religion, going to the highest representative of every known religion and asking each one, "Do you know the truth?" and realizing that each one would but state their own particular form of belief. I saw then that truth could not be a belief, it must be knowledge. But where, oh where, was that knowledge to be found? How could it be obtained? I received no answer then. My school life was much like that of other boys, I imagine, although there was always that undercurrent of questionings in regard to the object of life. Why sickness and unhappiness? Why death? Why were we born? The religious information on these points was vague, and on some points devoid of justice, mercy, or love. It was such a terrible picture that I resolutely closed my mind to it as much as possible, and took interest in the companions of my youth and their affairs. I desired the world of men rather than books, and went into a manufacturing business at the early age of 20. So soon after marrying the daughter of my partner, the latter became a spiritualist through losing his wife, and frequented seances for the purpose of communicating with her. But I found nothing in the Spiritist philosophy or the facts that drew me. A favorable opportunity offering, we sold our business in Montreal and went to Boston, where we established a similar one. Boston offered a larger field for my partner's quest among the Spiritists, and so many wonderful things were told to me that I was induced to attend a number of seances with him. In short, I found much fraud, and what little genuineness there was carried no evidence of the Spiritists' claims that the souls of the dead returned, quote, to communicate with easygoing mediums, unquote. Some of these experiences suggested the idea of hypnotism, which was then coming to the front. I took lessons from the best available teachers in the quote-unquote art, and practiced hypnotism for several years with unusual success. I also studied telepathy and clairvoyance. I had struck the line of, quote, the psychic powers latent in man, unquote, but did not understand the rationale. Many of the experiments I made were of much benefit to me in later years, for they gave me a practical understanding that I would not otherwise have had. Nevertheless, there was a grave danger in it all, and I cannot but think that there was some guidance which kept me from tumbling into unconscious black magic, although I had never heard of such a thing. I always had a strong regard for the rights of others, and would never use my power against another's will, or suggest any idea detrimental to the moral sense in the least degree. It was while in this line of thought that my partner brought word to me of the formation of a branch of the TS, Theosophical Society, in Boston. The word Theosophia suggested much, so I went to the first meeting. I knew at once, even from the meager presentation of the time, that here was what I had been in search of. I joined the society that evening, and was shortly after elected its secretary. William Q. Judge came to Boston soon after. I was introduced to him with other members, and had no other notice from him until after the meeting, when we had parted at the door, he going with some members to his hotel, and I in another direction. We got some distance apart when I heard him call out, "Good night, Crosby. I've got you on my list." I said good night, but was much exercised at the rest of his remark. Something, however, happened then. A veil was lifted. A tie was formed, which has never since been broken. He frequently came to Boston and stayed at my house, and I frequently went to New York. In another section of Crosby's writings, he mentions this about Mr. Judge, so we're stepping out from his biographical notes here to another quote. About Mr. Judge, Crosby later wrote, "The first theosophical treatise I read was his Epitome of Theosophy," his meaning Judge's. "My first meeting with him changed the whole current of my life. I trusted him then as I trust him now, and all those whom he trusted. Trust is the bond that binds, and makes the strength of the movement, for it is of the heart. And this trust he called forth was not allowed to remain a blind trust, for as time went on, as the energy, steadfastness, and devotion of the student became more marked, the real WQJ was more and more revealed, until that power radiated through him became in each an ever-present help in the work. As such, it remains today, a living power in each heart that trusted him. Mr. Crosby continues in his autobiographical note from 1907, I was made president of the TS in Boston. Subsequently, when the esoteric section was formed by HPB and William Q. Judge, I was admitted and afterwards was appointed its president. These positions I held until I left Boston in April 1900. In the early days, those who were first drawn to the TS were the spiritualists, also various kinds of faddists. When these found that theosophy did not pander to, nor agree with their preconceptions and prejudices, they took their departure. There were some, however, who sought for truth alone, and those remained. In the meantime, there was going on a great work, that of laying down the occult lines of force and centers of work. When it was remembered that HPB was for some years a visitor to this country before she, quote, woke up, unquote, Judge and Alcott, and formed the TS, the idea may be grasped that the most important work of a movement was not on the surface. The average person makes much of organization, form, method, authority, and whatnot, and in crystallization of idea defeats understanding. Thus, the attacks, splits, controversies, and other foibles that have been perpetuated during the history of the movement in this generation. You must have noticed that all the difficulties that have arisen in the TS raged around personalities. There have been no doctrinal differences. This is significant. You may also have observed that those who belittle Judge will be found belittling HPB. The TS represents the world. In it, in embryo, are fought the battles of the world. Ignorance, superstition, selfishness, ambition. All are there. But as the Master wrote once, so long as 3 true brave souls remain, the TS cannot be destroyed. It is my belief that the true TS is not contained in any one organization, but that its members exist in many organizations. The binding force being difficult to give understandingly, but I will try. So Robert Crosby was a student of HPB through correspondence beginning in 1888, the same year that she published The Secret Doctrine. You can imagine this was a very fertile time for the movement. After the death of Judge in 1896, Catherine Tingley became prominent in the TS. She established a new organization based in Point Loma, California. And at her request in 1900, Robert Crosby joined her to help with the work. He left in 1904, finding that Tingley was actually misleading and self-serving, and moved to Pasadena. And so he moved to Pasadena and started a study class in 1907. The original study class consisted mostly of his neighbors, including John Garrigues. On November 17th, 1908, he issued what was called, what he titled, "To All Open-Minded Theosophists." It was an open letter to everyone in the Theosophical movement of the time. It was issued by Mr. Crosby on the 33rd anniversary of the founding of the Theosophical Society by HPB in 1875. And it was this document that drew Mr. B.P. Wadia to attempt reforms within the TS with ultimately no effect. Inspired by this letter, Wadia and others left the TS and became associated with the ULT. Wadia was instrumental in expanding the ULT, including founding this lodge in Washington, D.C. in 1922. February 18th, 1909, the ULT itself was launched with the Declaration as its only basis. November of 1912, Theosophy magazine was founded with Mr. Crosby as the editor, and this was a task that he fulfilled until his death. The Theosophy School for Children was established in 1914 and incorporated into new lodges as they were established around the world. And then on June 25th, 1919, after 70 and a half years, Robert Crosby died as he had lived, calm and serene, and without complaint. And now we will have more on the legacy of Mr. Crosby.
Friends, Mr. Crosby, in his very last article, questioned, is theosophy a progressive system of religion? He says in his own words, there is such a knowledge as the wisdom religion, and it's the result of the observation and experience of the masters of wisdom, and as such stands for itself. The secret doctrine is not a series of vague theories or treatises, but is all that can be given out in this century. It will be centuries more before more is given. It is with some words as these that we can remember Mr. Crosby and his contribution to the Theosophical movement. He was faithful, loyal, and steadfast. Despite many changes that were going on in the movement, he was ever true to the spirit of HPB and to William Q. Judge, and he sort of carried that banner and, inaugurated a movement of faithfulness to their words, not to the way others were trying to alter or change to suit their purposes. He says that theosophy is those facts that anyone can observe and decide for oneself, can study, apply, and prove. And it's a presentation of knowledge that is gained through eons of time. So it's a process. He says that the present period has made it possible for every inquirer to obtain or study the Master's message as it was written. And that sort of encapsulates his influence on the Theosophical movement, is to preserve what the transmitter of the Mahatmas, Madame Blavatsky and William Q. Judge, had said. Though there were people during his time that were focused on personalities, he said, if change is to be brought about towards the enlightenment of humanity, someone must make the beginning. It is the first step that begins the count, and if the goal is a right one and a true one, the results can be left to time and karma, and we rest on that. So Robert Crosby was not only a steadfast force within the movement, but he was a pupil, a friend, and a companion to William Q. Judge, and in line, so to speak, to Madame Blavatsky. He preserved unbroken the lines of the Theosophical movement from the passing of Mr. Judge, and 13 years later made that link once more with the ULT. He founded Theosophy magazine, and all these activities connected with the Theosophical movement, and he was an inspiration and a sustainer from the beginning. It is said that there is always a witness on the scene, and after the death of Mr. Judge, Mr. Crosby was such a witness. Crosby, Mr. Judge said at their first meeting, "You're on my list," as you heard from the previous speaker. And no one at that time suspected, and none to this day has suspected, that the quiet, earnest, and steadfast man whose heart and soul were assimilated to the nature of HPB and William Q. Judge was to be in fact the agent for the regeneration of the Theosophical movement on the lines laid down from the beginning by the masters. It is said HPB was the creator, Judge was the preserver, and Crosby was the regenerator. When asked, Mr. Judge would say, students would ask Judge lots of questions. He would say, ask Crosby. He thinks and acts as I do. And in this way, he gave hints that Mr. Crosby would be the one to be true, and that he trusted Crosby in his communication and his knowledge of the philosophy. So he gave out such statements in regard to Mr. Crosby's nature, and it showed that he pointed to Crosby as an unbroken link in the chain. Though others were, confused in ambition and a desire to be a successor, Crosby was a quiet man, and he went about his work just doing what needs to be done. We're not making a big flap about it. So he was consistent and steadfast. The only published writing to which he ever affixed his signature was an article he wrote at the passing of Mr. Judge. And it was written by and signed by him because he was pointing out the true nature of Judge, and he wanted to show the way to any students who might be seeking to find that path. Otherwise, he wrote anonymously and wrote voluminously as the editor of Theosophy magazine, and he wrote questions and answers on the Gita, which many students have found enormously helpful, echoing their own questions. He was faithful, kind, ever a teacher and a guide to all those that sought him, that they might learn. They found his deep and enduring solace and satisfaction in pointing them to the nature of those great beings. Stick to the messengers and the message, he used to say. Ingratitude is not one of their vices, he would add. Go on with the work. We are working in the present for the future. Unless the nature of HPB and William Q. Judge is grasped, Theosophy is not understood and cannot be understood. He lived to see the work inaugurated by him grow until the United Lodge of Theosophists numbered hundreds of associates in all quarters of the world, devoted in unity of thought, will, and feeling to one aim, one purpose, one teaching, the dissemination of the fundamental principles of the philosophy of Theosophy. The magazine founded by him and of which he has been the chief editor now circulates in every civilized country. His burdens during the many years have been enormous. In addition to all these writings, he was a frequent speaker at the meetings of the United Lodge, and he was constantly at the service of the hundreds of students who sought his wise and benign counsels in their problems. He attended to them personally, under no matter what pressures upon his time and energies. He always gave kindly advice and suggestion. He never denied his help, but gave freely without limit. Eventually, as he got older, the toll on his body came about, and it is said that he passed away as he had lived, calm and serene, with no word of complaint, though he suffered greatly in the last few days. He left a large amount of work in the hands of the associates, and he said, "Do not grieve over failures and partial successes." He left these words, "It is the effort that counts. He who with the right motive and with sincere goodwill does the best that he can and all that he knows how to do, does enough." And the future will determine whether those in whose hands has been entrusted the work of Robert Crosby will prove true to their trust and carry it on as he has in the path of the predecessors. And with that, we'll do the final reading before we close for fellowship.
The number 4 reading comes from the writings of Mr. Crosby himself. A true theosophic life can be lived anywhere, alone or in crowds, for it is a life of right ideas. The only way to better conditions is through better ideas. Bettering conditions without bettering ideas merely puts men in a place more favorable for acting on wrong ideas and gives them opportunity for exploiting their selfishness. Everything depends upon the ideals that men hold. If people as a whole could be brought into the position of listening to the message of theosophy and applying it, the misery and suffering and hardship that now exist in the world would practically cease to exist. But they must first desire and choose to listen. Theosophy must be understood to be a gift to mankind by more progressed beings than ourselves. We must learn and apply the fundamental principles which underlie that ground philosophy and understand the operation of law as disclosed therein. Then, and then only, can we begin to make theosophy a living power in our lives. If each student did this, all would have one aim, one purpose, one teaching, and a sure basis for united effort. Such differences of individual opinion as might arise would be solved by a careful adjustment of these to the philosophy. Thus all would be united, all preserve the utmost freedom of thought, all progress most rapidly by self-induced and self-devised efforts. No one then would make the fatal blunder of imagining that theosophy is something which can be developed, but each would devote his thought and effort to growth along the lines that theosophy indicates, so that he may become the better able to help and teach others. The laws and principles of existence, the true rationale of life, are presented by theosophy. Hence, each man's contact with it is alike an opportunity and a responsibility, to which he has been brought under karma. He can make the most of it, or he may neglect it, so as to fail to obtain or extend benefit. His refusal to take advantage of it now will make him less determined in some other life to carry out the purpose of his nature, which is defeated presently if he neglects, under any circumstance or pressure, that which he sees to be leading him in the right direction. Theosophy is for those who want it. We are to hold, wait, and work for those few earnest souls who will grasp the plan and further the cause. Many have their ears so dulled or their attention so diverted that no number of repetitions can reach them. Yet theosophy must be held out continually for all who will listen. That is our self-assumed work. We have our example in HPB and William Quan Judge as to means, method, and manner. Let us imitate them and so do their work in their spirit. This ends our program. This is a celebration day, so we are here to reinitiate our bonds and enjoy our companionship with each other. Thank you for coming.
Next week's talk is on the challenge for truth. Please join us then. Thank you.